I have been so fascinated by trying to understand autism and complex trauma really since last year. I think right before I went to France last summer, I was really starting to read a lot about autism, especially high masking autism. And what I want to do here on these videos is talk about this intersection between autism, high masking autism, and complex trauma. Because this is where I think it gets gray and confusing and nuanced, and there are a lot of similarities and places where we can have a lot of overlap, often even because it's always been that way. For example, we had to socially camouflage since childhood, and now we just think that's who we are. Same thing for having what I call a trauma personality. You had to fawn and please and appease, and that's just who you think you are as a caretaker because you've never known anything different. And my goal for today's video is for you to leave this video having a good understanding of the similarities and differences between really social camouflaging in autism and pleasing and appeasing, fawning in complex trauma. And to understand that there can be a significant overlap. You can be doing both. You can be autistic and be fawning and be autistic. But the goal is to help you dive deeper into understanding the important differences and perhaps to help you begin to sort out more and more. Well, is it trauma? Is it autism? I will say that it's not that simple. And it seems very clear that especially if you believe you are autistic, it's almost impossible to pull out the trauma. There are places to understand the impact of the trauma. But, I think you have to pretty much assume that you're going to have some trauma if you're autistic, even if you had the most, beautifully developmental, perfectly balanced childhood, the world doesn't necessarily have that same response to you. So you're going to have to adapt and adopt some social engagement strategies in order to survive that world, and that can also be inherently traumatic. The last thing I'll say is I also have gotten really curious about, I wonder, because of this lack of diagnosis, especially in certain communities, how many of us who believe we might be autistic also had or have eggshell parents? And many of you know I use this term eggshell parents because it really does encompass what it feels like to live in a state of hypervigilance or to become steeped in hypervigilance because you had a parent or caregiver or both with whom you never knew really what to expect. They were emotionally, relationally, and behaviorally unpredictable, unstable, in varying degrees. Could have been only in childhood, now they're great, but it doesn't matter. If you had a parent or parents or mentally ill siblings or grandparents, or even now in an adult relationship, though I'm talking about childhood today, where you're scanning, you need to read, and then you make meaning and respond in kind. That is the essence of hypervigilance. And hypervigilance drives both eggshell patterns in terms of how we survive and respond, and the dynamics around social camouflaging, the needing to scan in autism, especially in high masking, where we often have, a little bit different ability to at least know or detect that what we're doing isn't quite right. And then we try to make adjustments and strategies in some essence to sort of handle that. So let's talk about the primary fundamental differences between fawning or pleasing and or appeasing and social camouflaging. First of all, the concepts around what it means to fawn, to please, really fall under this dynamic of it being a survival strategy, one of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, submit, attach, cry for help. Those are two extra ones you might not hear about so much. But the dynamics involved often in relational traumas, and that we learn to often combine a couple to sort of survive our childhoods. And so the idea is that fawning at the core is really about developing a skill through hypervigilance where we learn to read the social, emotional, thought cues, behavioral cues of our caregivers often, or of those who force us to walk on eggshells. And that we also do that And at the same time, while we're doing that, we're often suppressing, neglecting our own needs, our own sensations, cutting ourselves off from who we are in the service of pleasing others, right? In appeasing them. And that becomes one of the important ways to survive. So if you had an eggshell parent, for example, my best friend just shared, I've talked a lot about like the hypervigilance we can have when we know they're coming home. I think coming home is a big one. A lot of parents struggle with that transition, right? You come in, the house is a mess, the chores aren't done. Even in the best case scenario, it's just a lot for our brains. But we were talking about, I'm doing a project where I'm really working more and more on these concepts around how, the garage door pops up, or the tires on the gravel driveway I've shared before, and you know that means something by the sound of it because of your eggshell parent. And she was saying that when her mom would walk down on her clickety-clack high heels holding her keys, that in the apartment complex on the sidewalk, how she walked, my friend could detect what the night was going to look like. And, we might be like, oh my God, I have to look busy. I need to oh my gosh, the chores aren't done. We're afraid of the outcome, and we learn to read. So hypervigilance, as I said, is also involved in camouflaging. We're going to come back to that. But the idea is that you learn to do this outside-in orientation again and again and again. And there are some connections here to our nervous system, but the initial reading is often that fight or flight, that mobilized sympathetic response. And then the concepts around fawning or pleasing or appeasing have been discussed as that we basically overuse or kind of fake our way through ventral vagal connection or a dorsal vagal shutdown, an immobilized state, and that numbing of ourselves to serve others. And that when we do that again and again and again, that leads to chronic fatigue, illness, burnout, and things like that, okay? So the goal is this outside-in orientation and the sacrificing of self. Now, similarly, in social camouflaging, which includes masking, we're going to talk about, it's the same thing for different reasons. The social part is important, right? The social piece drives the hypervigilance and the need to camouflage for those with autism. So in this sense, they are using hypervigilance to detect, to read, to blend in, to create strategies for acceptance, to engage and appear more neurotypical. That's the concept that drives the social camouflaging. Now, in my mind, though, this is why I've been so interested in this topic, is that where the overlap is significant is in what I call your trauma mask or your trauma personality. And this is where basically you have been using fight or flight, freeze, fawn for so long, just like in camouflaging, that you don't even really know who you are. It's just you think it's who you are. You think you're just like the best caretaker and you're a self-sacrificer, and maybe you are, but you're not just an empath for no reason, potentially, right? Maybe you were born with a sensitive temperament and a more intense awareness of others, but it was shaped and cultivated by needing to rotate and be an outside-in orientator with your eggshell parents. So what we're doing also with autism in the social dynamic, so if we're at home alone, theoretically, in a different world, let's say you woke up in an autistic planet where no one cared how you acted socially, you wouldn't need to camouflage. So you're more likely, the whole point of this is that it's in the social piece. Whereas fawning, sure, it could be socially. You might, fawn with your friends and your coworkers, but it happened in your home also. Like I said earlier, if it was in this video or another one, but also if you had, like, let's say a really authoritarian parent who was neurotypical or was maybe autistic but didn't have any awareness, and they were very harsh on you and critical and judgmental, you could also have that same trauma through trying to be socially connected at home, right? So it can happen in both cases. But here's where the overlap is so striking to me, is that with high masking autism and trauma, we can have this mask, this personality that is oriented around survival, whether it's human engagement, socially or otherwise, by not being a threat, by hiding your traits, by blending in, by appeasing and pleasing, by denying yourself, and then neglecting yourself and suppressing yourself in the service of those things for both camouflaging and pleasing, appeasing, or fawning. Now let's dive in a little bit more into the heart of fawning, and then we're going to end with talking about the differences and similarities as they relate to camouflaging with autism. So, as I said, this fawn response can really manifest in a lot of different ways. And I thought we'd talk about some signs that you're engaging in fawning to give you an idea. The first one is you're often constantly attempting to please and appease others. That makes sense, right? You're often looking to others. What do they want? What do they need? What do they believe? And then you craft your response, what you say or share. You might believe something different, but you're not likely to actually say that if you're hardcore in this like fawning dynamic. You can have a lot of identity issues around who is your authentic true self, and that certainly happens in autism as well, especially if you've had to do a lot of camouflaging and masking. But at the core, you weren't able to fully develop who you were because you were developing around another. And that is that kind of like caretaking, fawning persona that you think is just who you are. In part, it might be, like I said, but often that was developed for a reason. Difficulty saying no, setting and holding boundaries, right? Because that would imply you have a separate entitled sense of self. And if you were really steeped in that, pleasing and appeasing, it might feel like you don't know who that, you're not allowed to do those boundaries. You wouldn't even know what they are. You don't even know what you need, things like that. Minimizing, ignoring your own beliefs and thoughts, flying under the radar to avoid detection. And so you don't, you kind of like eggshell tiptoe because you don't want to upset others. So it's more of a response. Over apologizing. Certainly things like chronic pain and illness we know can be associated with these types of trauma responses in childhood. Taking responsibility for others' emotions, right? So your parent blows and you blame yourself, or you're like, oh, that's my fault if I had only done this or that. Or maybe you actually take the heat to relieve the pressure between two fighting parents. Oh no, it's my fault, stop fighting, things like that. Being a fixer or rescuer. Attempting to manage or control others because you're trying to reduce the emotionality or responses in some way. People talk about it being a manipulative response. It's not often an intentionally manipulative, like thoughtful mastermind thing, but it's like you've learned to move the chess pieces in the caretaking dynamic or pleasing. And then denying your own truth, your own pain, your own power, your own discomfort, your own anger, all of that. So that's the heart of what happens with this appeasing and pleasing and fawning. Now, I want you to hold that as we talk about the similarities and differences with autism. So when we're talking about high masking, we're really talking about social camouflaging. And I'm going to link a site down below. You can go take a couple tests online of quick assessments that were developed around masking and camouflaging and things like that. But there are three main components when we're talking about social camouflaging and autism. The first one is compensation. And this is the concept that we use strategies to overcome social difficulties related to autism. So these are things we're doing to deal with the challenges of having autistic traits as they might manifest in social interactions. So things like using scripts, copying others, carefully observing others, things like that. The second one is masking. We often use this one. And this is really about strategies we use to hide these characteristics that might ding, 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 apparently make us look more autistic, right? And so these are things that involve concealing and suppressing things that we would do if we weren't trying to be accepted or to blend in. And that can look like constantly monitoring your own behavior. How much eye contact have I made for how many seconds? My facial expression, yours, gestures, to basically present a non-autistic persona to others. And lastly, assimilation. And this is about strategies we use to avoid standing out during social interactions, including blending in and appearing more similar to more neurotypical individuals. So these are like behavioral techniques, things like that, used to fit in, and really kind of like performing and pretending. We're going to talk about that in a minute, in ways that help you be less identified potentially as autistic. But once again, you may have no idea, and that's the whole trauma personality or trauma mask or autistic mask that the literature talks about, that I'm talking about, where all this gets so complicated because, of course, it seems to be autistic is to have trauma. But when you start to get into the nuances of like, which came first, how did that play out? You may have been doing it so long that you don't even know. And that's what I'm trying to get to is like, okay, is it this? Is it that? And what are the similarities and differences? On the website, which I love, I'll also link down below, neurodivergentinsights.com. It's an excellent website with excellent graphics. One of the quotes is that I think the psychologist had mentioned there that for autistic people, to have to socialize is inherently experienced as a sensory demand. So if you think about the role often of sensory sensitivities, though both autism and complex trauma can have them, it feels like they're very profound in autism, right? They are so much more than, oh, I had this trauma and now I'm sensitive to this thing. It's like everything on different levels for you, right? Volume up or down. But things like smell and sound and lighting and sense of, taste, texture, fabric, clothing, it's like this assault and that you can't control. And it creates a lot of dysregulation in us, right? I've talked about my dog that just, oh my God, even when she was little, she's always had this thing and she just smells so bad. And it can make me so angry if I'm not in the right mindset. And I feel like a total jerk. It's just like, I can't deal with that right now. And before I began this discovery and understanding like, why do these things bother me? Why is it a temperature or a food thing? Why is it a smell thing? Why is everything in my house so soft? Why do I have candlelight in the morning? Like it was just on and on and on and on and on. It went so much bigger than my childhood could explain. Because as I've shared, I think I've had frankly more PTSD and even more relational trauma with my mother, PTSD in general, with my kids, with my marriage, like seriously traumatic events, medical events, serious medical events, life-changing medical events, accidents, violence, things like that. And then my mom was actually worse in my adult life. And I was all of these things way before that, all of them. And, being a child who was like picky and dysregulated and cried a lot. And, my mom would always say, I think I've shared like, oh, you weren't that easy to raise. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I'm an only child. Like I was a pleaser. But I think it was all of these things that were so difficult for me to regulate that were hard for her alongside her inability to navigate her own dysregulation. So anyway, that being said, we're talking about those dynamics. And so let's talk about, though, how all of this plays out for us when we have an autistic set of traits or a diagnosis like this, right? So how do you know if you are doing a masking behavior that you're masking, right? How do you recognize it? So first of all, it comes from, like I said, looking at cues of others, maybe it's TV shows or people around you, mimicking gestures, mimicking, sentences, conversations, adjusting your tone of voice to match others, observing hiding stimming behaviors or, finding more acceptable ones. So you skin pick instead of hand flap, for example. That's a more extreme one, but that's all I can think of right now. But the idea is that you modify it. You're still doing it in some way. Developing a repertoire, hiding your interests of who you really are, what you like, what you love, and forcing yourself into eye contact, social dynamics, things like that. So what does it feel like? How does it look and feel inside your brain and body and mind when you are masking? Now, I would argue as I'm saying all of these, that fawning, knowing you're fawning could feel very similar, knowing that you're appeasing, but you'd have to be sort of aware of the idea, and that's part of the healing, is to start to become aware of what's happening for you. So this is where the overlap is. Primarily, the symptoms are really about the masking experience, but I really want you to think about how your fawning behaviors and appeasing might also feel if you were able to get in touch with, oh, wait a minute, this isn't actually all of who I am, and there's something happening inside that's letting me know, all right? So some signs you're masking, and once again, these next two slides are gonna come from neurodivergentinsights.com. All right, so constantly being preoccupied with how others perceive you and striving to meet their expectations. Now go back to hypervigilance. How do you know that you need to be preoccupied with how they're perceiving you? How do you detect how they're perceiving you? You're scanning, you're reading, right? So we're having a conversation and I'm paying attention to how much are we looking each other in the eye? Oh, my voice went too high right there. And when I get nervous or I'm in a hurry, I talk really fast. I sometimes stutter, and I leave that in these videos for you guys a lot of the time now. I edit them out when I can, but see, I start to have like 2 different thoughts at once, and so the word comes out weird. But I'm monitoring that, let's say if I'm hypervigilant, right? Diligently adjusting your body language, to appear interested. So all of a sudden you realize you're doing this, and then you're like, oh, I need to soften that and try to like be more opening and engaging with you. Having a heightened awareness of the impression you make on others, scanning again, and then it comes back to self-consciousness. Oh my God, I said that weird, and why did I say that? And that's that hovering over the self that I think occurs in both complex trauma and camouflaging. Continuous monitoring of your facial expressions, your body language, once again, to fit social norms. So in this environment, at this club, I can do it this way. At this event, I do it that way. Feeling compelled to make eye contact even when it's overwhelming and uncomfortable, because that's what you're supposed to do. Persistent vigilance in monitoring and adjusting your body language. Persistent vigilance, that is chronic hypervigilance. In monitoring and adjusting your body language to project, like I kind of just said, a relaxed demeanor. And then let's talk about what it looks like when you're pretending. So this matches a lot of those strategies we were talking about around compensation and assimilation. But the idea here is that if you really thought about it, you'd realize that conversations actually don't feel that natural. They feel unnatural. They're not that smooth, even when you're faking your way through it. You often find yourself pretending to be normal in social situations, whatever you think normal is supposed to be. You rely on the support or presence of others to navigate those social interactions. So you will never go to the mall by yourself, or you won't go ask a question by yourself. You won't go answer the front door by yourself to the pizza person, things like that. You have a belief that you can't really be yourself around others. So you know that if you actually did the things you normally do without the social piece, that you worry you would be judged or ostracized or criticized or made fun of. You try to avoid or minimize interactions with others in social settings. So you know that in a social situation, you're more likely, if you're nervous, to say too much or talk too loud or shut down or whatever. I've talked a lot about me doing such a terrible job at networking events, and just I didn't know what was wrong with me. Like, I could be confident and do all these things, but why would it happen there? So you might not go to things. I started just saying to myself, like, I have to figure out how to grow my practice a different way. Like, I cannot do this. And I also hate it. And even if I could fake my way through it, it was so stressful. Social situations feel like a performance rather than a chance for really authentic connecting. And interacting with others requires intentional, conscious effort, and it feels forced. So those are from the website I just mentioned, from Neurodivergent Insights, talking about masking, right? That's how we would kind of like, that's the internal read of what we're doing. Now, I just want to use this exact same slide and talk about what it might look like if you were raised to be a pleaser. So same thing, conversations don't feel natural and they don't flow smoothly. Now, maybe it's not so much about how it's coming out, but you have to talk about the things that they want to talk about. You have to present yourself as a certain version, not so much from an autistic perspective, but like care about the things they care about, or be the therapist to your mother or father or parent, right? Be a best friend. Have conversations about their sex life that you would rather not, but that's what you do or were trained to do. And not until you go to therapy do you realize how much that was not okay for you, things like that. The point is, it's not about, because often if you're with somebody, you've learned to make it about them. And so it's not as natural as it could be. You find yourself pretending to be normal. Certainly with trauma, we can feel like aliens, just like with autism. But it's not so much like I'm from a different planet, which is what I realize is more autistic. I think not feeling normal is like the shame piece. And the shame can occur in both autism and trauma. for similar and different reasons. But if we're talking about, let's say, appeasing, we are basically just trying to be a different version to appease them because of this root of we're going to be rejected and not good enough because we are fundamentally flawed. This is where it gets tricky, but let's pretend we're not autistic at all. There's that deep shame piece. So that can drive that sense of like, well, I'm not worthy anyway, so, or I only feel worthy when I make it about you. There's a belief that you can't fully be yourself, the same thing, right? So you crafted this trauma mask version of yourself. You feel the need to put on an act, once again, perform. Different driving of it, but the same kind of outcome is to be loved, accepted, to be, operating in a role that helped you survive that you can't stop engaging in. Minimizing interactions, you could certainly have social anxiety as a result of childhood trauma or any kind of relational trauma or trauma in general. Social performances don't really feel authentic to you. Maybe you're an introvert and you have complex trauma. And so in that sense, it feels like you can't be who you are, but maybe you had a parent who forced you to be more extroverted and do a lot of things. You hated it. So it's like, you're not really sure, do I hate that? Do I not? But it doesn't feel good inside. And just the idea that fundamentally, if you're fawning and pleasing, eventually that's going to be exhausting. That's the whole thing I was talking about with polyvagal theory, is that you are pretending to be another version, just like with autism, but for the sake of survival, and that your body will pay a price. So even as I was saying those, I'm like, it gets so crazy nuanced. The core of this, though, I hope this helps you understand kind of what drives these things. And I really believe that the burden and the pain of this intersection of trauma and autism, is that we often bear what I call the silent trauma, right? The silent trauma of, I am learning to present this version to you, whether it's from trauma or autism or both, but no one else sees that I can fake my way through a meeting but feel dysregulated. No one else sees that I was watching your eye contact and this smell in the room, I wanted to like run out of here, but I couldn't do that at a business meeting, or things like that. The sound of my colleague chewing makes me want to scream, but I can't do that. And so I'm, it's fine, but I'm not fine. And so I think that the hard part is, for both of these, we're bearing this pain inside often, this struggle that no one else sees. And they can often, as I said, overlap. You can be doing both. And the last thing I'll say is that as I've done this, if I didn't mention in this video, because I made this video, I think, once or twice before I reshot it today, but is this idea that I really believe that there are many of us who think we might be on the spectrum who also had either autistic and or eggshell or both. And yet those parents didn't know it. So for example, let's just say you had one neurotypical parent and one who was potentially eggshell for whatever reason, borderline, narcissism, whatever. And so you have a really difficult combination. You have this very activated nervous system in you, this heightened hypervigilance and awareness to something about me is different and not tolerated. And then you have a parent perhaps who was very dysregulated a lot of the time. And so all of that is like an assault. And I think, as I've said, and I'll keep saying, I truly believe, no matter what anyone says, that there is so much more yelling and screaming and boundary violations than we ever really want to admit in a lot of homes. That a lot of parents believe that because they're not putting their hands on a child, that the yelling and screaming isn't as bad. And, it is emotionally wounding, and it is devastating to our nervous system to have to go into fight or flight every time our parents get in a fight, or our mentally ill sibling loses it, or our grandmother starts saying really hurtful, inappropriate, angry, loud things. That when it happens again and again and again, it is an assault to our nervous systems. And that is true for both autism and for trauma. I think for all of these reasons, these topics are really important, and my goal is to help you. We'll talk in the next video about unmasking and what you could start to do to work on identifying pleasing and appeasing, and the dynamics around camouflaging and masking, because it might be that you're paying a significant price in your relationships and your sense of self and your health and body. And it's not going to be something you can just easily, I know that now, I'll change it. Like I said earlier, it's often so wired into our stories that we just think it's who we are. And we've yet to uncover that parts might be, but other parts are not and don't have to be. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Take care.